Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/TMHP and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. Go to audibletrial.com/TMHP.
What's up, y'all? It's your boy Dez, the producer of the Morning Huddle podcast, hitting you guys off with another episode this Monday morning. Now, today's show is all about grief. More specifically, grief you feel from losing a loved one. Now, this is something that everyone listening right now has dealt with at some point in life, and we all had to learn how to grieve in our own special way. But today, Eric is going to help you learn how to better cope with that grief. So stay tuned and listen up real good, because this is a show you don't want to miss.
Good morning. It's time for your Morning Huddle, where we address how situations impact your mental health. In each episode, we take a deep dive into mental health issues by looking at ways to cope with mental illness and ways to break mental health stigmas. We talk about everything from emotional abuse to physical abuse and how to get help when you need it. There's no need to suffer in silence, because Eric is here to coach you to better mental health. Here's your host, Eric the Counselor.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of the Morning Huddle podcast. I am your host, Eric the Counselor, and let me just tell you right now, today is a beautiful day. It's a day to be thankful for, because some of us didn't make it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the grieving process, all right? And so before we get into all the show information, I just want to invite you guys to follow me on Instagram. You can check me out at Eric_the Counselor. That's where I am online. That's where I'm interacting with the listeners. That's where I'm meeting new people. That's where I'm answering questions. And that's where I am getting the feedback about the show. And I'm very grateful that you guys are listening to the show. And I am just blessed to know that the show content, the speakers, all the information that we give, the stories that they tell, I'm just so blessed to know that this stuff is actually helping you guys in your life as well. As you may be able to hear in the background, I am actually outside today. I'm recording the show outside. I'm sitting on the lake at one of my spots. Dez is not going to be able to be on the show with us today, so I just decided, let me just go out to the lake and do a show. The sun is shining right off the water. It's just glistening. The birds are chirping. I can see fish jumping around in the water. So it's just a great morning. And again, it's a day that all of us should be grateful to see, because some of us just did not make it today. All right. Hey, if you are looking for, or if anyone that you know is looking for a mental health speaker, I would like for you to consider hiring Eric the Counselor. I would really like for you to consider bringing me to your next event. The thing that you should know about me when it comes to speaking, I don't chase a paycheck for this. You know, I'm all about chasing passion. And my passion is helping break down the stigmas and break down any barriers that might be preventing people from seeking out mental health. That's what I'm passionate about. And so if you're looking for someone, or if you know someone who needs a speaker, it could be a workshop, it could be a training, it could be coming to a high school. I love to talk to athletes and football teams. Man, anything that you need a mental health speaker for, please consider me. And if you are considering me, or you know someone who is considering to bring in a speaker, please send them to my website, ericthecounselor.com. That's where they can learn a little bit about me, and that's where they can also submit their request to have me come out to speak. So that's ericthecounselor.com. If you or anyone you know is looking for a mental health speaker. So let's get into today's show. Before we get into it, I just want to say this. I want to dedicate today's show to the entire Tennessee State University family, the TSU family. Over the weekend, we had one of our student athletes had a major brain injury. We were playing against Vanderbilt University. Many of you listening to this may have either been at the game or may have heard about it in some sort of media, either ESPN or online somewhere. You may have heard about our student Christian Abercrombie. He had a major brain injury, and he was immediately transported to Vanderbilt Hospital, which luckily we were playing on the campus of Vanderbilt, so he was able to get there in just minutes, which later we found out while I was there with the family and the rest of the administration at the university. As some of you know, I am the assistant director of the counseling center at Tennessee State University. And so anytime something happens with any of our students, we are the ones who receive some of those first phone calls to come and be a support for whatever student and whatever the situation is. And so being at the hospital yesterday with the family, the outlook was not so great. But hey, we are still praying, and we believe that miracles can happen. We believe miracles take place every day, and right now we are all praying for a miracle for the Abercrombie family. And so I just want to dedicate today's show to the entire TSU family, which includes the Abercrombie family, and maybe it includes you as well. So let's get into it. Today I'm going to be talking about the grieving process. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss the normal grieving process. I'm going to talk to you guys about the stages of grief. And then I'm going to end with an exercise for you to complete if you are currently in the grieving process. So let's start off with the definition of grief. Grief is defined as the natural emotional response resulting from a significant loss, especially the death of a loved one. How many of you listening to this show has experienced the loss of a loved one? I know for sure I have. In 2004, my oldest sister passed away in a car accident. It was around a month after my graduation from Tennessee State University undergrad school. A month later, my sister passed away suddenly. And so I went from a place of extreme elation after the completion of my educational pursuits at that time to total depression, total emptiness. And so I went from one end of the spectrum to the next end of the spectrum, and it was all resulting from the significant loss of my sister. Now, the thing that everyone needs to know is that each of us is going to deal with grief differently. Some people might laugh, some people might cry. I oftentimes hear people say that they try to stay busy so that they're not thinking about what happened. Some people feel sick. Some people have this numbness that takes over their entire body. It's also important to know that some people recover quickly while others need to take more time. Grief is a natural healing process, and it's important to know that there's no right way to do it. But there is a healthy way to do it. Okay? Now, for some people, grief can become way too painful. And what I mean by that is that your grief has grown into something that's no longer just grief, but it's now anxiety and depression, or mostly depression. For some people, grief might last way too long, and it can take over our lives, and we can go on, and year after year, we are having what's known as complicated grief. And I'm going to talk to you guys about complicated grief here in just a moment. And before I even talk about complicated grief, I'm just going to put out this statistic that says about 10% of people develop complicated grief after a loss. 10%. And so what that means is that most of us who are going through grief may not experience that complicated grief, the grief that lasts year after year after year. Now, if you are a person that's suffering from complicated grief or had complicated grief at some point in your past, that doesn't mean that you grieved the wrong way. That just means that you needed more time to heal from your pain. Okay? So what I want to do now is I want to get into what's known as the normal grief process. Okay? Grief generally starts immediately after a loss, right? And that first stage of, not necessarily the first stage, but that first part of grief is what's known as acute grief. And again, acute grief is that grief that's felt immediately after the loss, and it can last for months after the fact. Okay? It's that time after your loss where you will have intense symptoms of shock. You will feel this sense of distress. You will feel sadness. You might stop eating well. You might not be sleeping well. You might not be focused on the things that you need to be focused on. That's your acute grief. That's the grief that comes immediately after the loss. And now the thing that you need to know about grief is it doesn't only apply to losing a family member or the death of a lost one. The death of a loved one. It could be the loss of a job. That's something that a lot of people grieve. It could be moving to a new place. That could actually cause grief, in that adjustment period. Here's the fact. Acute grief, when you are experiencing acute grief and experiencing those symptoms of shock and the distress and the sadness, it's important to know that these symptoms will slowly diminish as time moves on. Now, what I am not saying is that time heals all wounds. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that in this acute grief, your symptoms should begin to diminish as time moves on. And as time moves on, you move from acute grief into what's known as integrated grief. And this is a part of the normal grieving process. You go from acute grief to integrated grief. And let me explain to you what I mean by integrated grief. So after resolving the most intense of your symptoms that are caused from acute grief or in that acute grief phase, those symptoms again, the shock, the distress, the sadness, the not eating, the trouble sleeping, the not being focused. After you resolve those symptoms, you will enter into what's known as a lifelong stage of integrated grief. Now, at this point, you have come to accept the reality of the loss, and you've resumed to your normal daily functioning. You've resumed to your normal life's activities. Now, in this phase, it's important to remember, because I kind of struggled with this, and I know a lot of other people actually do struggle with this as well. When you are at the point to where you have accepted the reality of the loss, that does not mean that you miss or that doesn't mean that you don't miss your loved one. And it also doesn't mean that you don't love them either. It just means that you've accepted their loss, okay? And it doesn't mean that you don't feel the pain when you think about their memory. What it does mean is that you have just learned how to cope and live your normal life, okay? Now, it's also important to know that acute grief may show itself again. And, of course, you hear these types of things often where, around the holidays, people begin to think about their loved ones, and that's when their memories come back, and it's a sad time. And I know the holidays are actually coming up now, and so I'm reminded of an idea that the holidays are not always a happy time for everybody. Actually, the holidays can be quite depressing for those people who may have lost a person close to the holidays. Another time that people really struggle with the loss of their loved one, even after they've accepted the reality, is around their birthdays or special anniversaries. Those are the times where your acute grief symptoms might show up again, all right? Even though you've moved on to the integrated phases or the integrative part or integrative, period of your grief, you will still have memories of those people. And those memories are great. And even though you've accepted their loss, it does not mean that you no longer love or care about those people. And so that's what the normal grief process looks like. It goes from acute grief to integrated grief. Now, let's go and talk about complicated grief. Now, this is a period that's between or after the immediate shock, after those immediate symptoms, that we've mentioned multiple times today. I'll say it again: shock, distress, sadness, poor appetite, trouble sleeping, and poor concentration. Those are the symptoms in the acute grief. After a few months of that period of time, maybe even a year or so, if you've not moved into the integrated grief phase, the phase of grief where you've accepted the loss, you might be considered having complicated grief. All right? And this is when your symptoms from the acute grief seem to never go away. You might feel that things will never change. And this is the phase that can last for years. I think about, my mother after my sister passed away. For year after year after year, I witnessed my mother have this complicated grief. It's the type of grief that makes you feel like the loss of a loved one continues to feel unreal. It's like, even though it's happened, it just seems unimaginable. It seems that you can't even think about the fact that this person is gone, because it just seems so unreal. And then that pain begins to be unmanageable. You can't even manage the way you feel anymore. And you, in this complicated grief, you will constantly yearn for the presence of the deceased person, or you will yearn for, another job, or you will yearn for the days when things used to be this way. And then you might begin to experience guilt about the simple idea of moving on and accepting the loss. I know for me, when my sister passed away, there was a time where I just had to realize that, okay, it's final. My sister, she's no longer with us. And then I remember in my mind telling myself that the best way for me to really handle this is to tell myself that I once had an older sister. For some reason, that was what helped me accept my reality. That's what helped me. It was just a thought that I needed to accept this, and I needed to begin to move on. But if your grief seems like it will never go away, it's been year after year after year, then you are definitely dealing with complicated grief. And I will tell you this, complicated grief can be treated by going to see a professional counselor. You may even need to go and see a psychiatrist at some point to get some prescribed medication. And that's okay. Medication is okay. I really think that it is. I'm not a big advocate for it, but sometimes I think that it will be useful to go along with treatment from a therapist. And so that's the normal grief process. The acute grief, which is the immediate shock after the loss. Then you move on to the phase of integrated grief, where you have accepted the reality of the loss. And then we have complicated grief, which is that grief that comes after your acute grief, the initial shock and the depression. If things don't get better for you after a few, there's no specific or limited amount of time, but it's just an observation of, all right, these symptoms don't seem to be going away. They actually seem to be getting worse. Then you are a person who has complicated grief. Okay? So keep that in mind. That's the normal grief process. Now, if you have grieved in a way that's not how I've defined it, that's totally okay, because it goes back to the fact that everyone deals with grief differently. This is just the general grieving process, okay? It's not a time for you to think that, well, I grieve the wrong way. That's not what this is about, okay? All right, so now that we've discussed the grieving process, now I want to talk to you about the stages of grief. Now, there's different models that talk about a different number of stages, but for today, I'm going to talk about a model that has 5 stages of grief, all right? And these are the 5 primary responses to a loss. These stages are the denial stage, the anger stage, the bargaining stage, depression stage, and finally, the acceptance stage. All right? Now, before I talk about these stages, it's important to know that someone who is grieving may go through these stages in any order, and they may return to previous stages even if they've moved on, okay? There's no set rhyme or reason to how a person will experience grief. So let's get into the first stage. The first stage of grief is the denial stage, right? This is that stage where you're telling yourself, oh my God, this just cannot be happening. When my sister passed away back in 2004, and I got the phone call from my youngest sister, and she was telling me about what happened, immediately my body went numb. I fell to the floor, and I just couldn't believe that this was happening. I'm like, no. And I remember as I was calling my friend to give me a ride to my mother's house to meet up with my sisters, I remember thinking, like, this just cannot be happening. I remember the fact that my mother was on a plane with my grandmother and my aunt, and they were all going to enjoy a vacation in Jamaica. And my sister died in a car accident after she dropped my mom off at the airport. I'm like, this just cannot be happening. I didn't want to accept the fact that this has happened, is what I'm getting to. And so that's what happens in that first stage of grief. It's that stage where you may refuse to accept the fact that a loss has occurred. You might be trying to minimize or just outright deny the situation at all. That's what I did. I was like, this just cannot be happening. I remember taking a nap, thinking that, all right, I'm going to take a nap because I just wanted to fall asleep. And then I woke up and it was like, okay, this is happening. But I still didn't want it to be happening. I was in a deep place of denial because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to handle how I was feeling. I didn't even know what to do next with the situation. I'm now in a position to where I am the oldest and the one that's in charge. My mom was gone. My oldest sister had just died in a car accident. Now it's on me. And I didn't know what to do. And I was like, oh my God, this cannot be happening. And so maybe you are in that denial phase of grief right now. I know for a fact, my TSU family, we just cannot believe that this kid is dealing with this right now. We can't believe that he's dealing with this right now. And at the time of this recording, he is still with us and fighting for his life. And we are all praying and we know that it's in God's hands. But at the same time, we're like, this just cannot be happening. This is not supposed to happen. And so that's that first stage of denial. And then the next stage is the stage of anger. And this is when you find yourself asking the question, why is this happening to me? When you realize that a loss has occurred, you may become angry at yourself. You might even become angry at another person. You will begin to argue that the situation is unfair and try to place the blame on somebody. You have to place the blame somewhere. I'm thinking about just this past week when I was seeing one of my clients and she was telling me about her family, and she was telling me that when her mom passed away, that her aunts blamed her, my client, for her mother's death. I would go so far as to say that aunt was in the anger phase of grief, and she had to place blame, and the person she needed to place the blame on was my client. That's what happens sometimes. You're asking, why is this happening to me? Why? Why is this happening? Some of you might be blaming yourself for the loss of your loved one. Some of you might be blaming yourself for the loss of a job or any type of loss. You're mad at yourself. You're placing the blame on yourself. You're telling yourself that this is all unfair. But again, you're asking, why is this happening to me? That's the anger phase. Then the next phase is the bargaining phase, this is a phase that those of you listening that have ever gone through the grief process or might be in the grief process right now, you might be telling yourself this, I will do anything to change this. That's the bargaining phase. That's what you think in this phase. I will do anything to change this. I remember when my sister died, I was like, why couldn't it have been me? Why did my sister have to leave? I think about the way she died. I'm like, Lord, why did she have to go that way? It was horrific. And in this bargaining phase, you might try to change or delay the loss. And what I mean by that, let's say you break up with you're mourning the loss of a relationship, right? And you are trying to change the situation. And what you will do is you will just return to your partner after the breakup. Okay? That's what you'll do. You might start to look for unlikely cures in the case of a terminal illness. Like you are trying to do anything to change the situation. Even in the face of the loss, you're trying to bargain to make things different. The next phase is the phase that we can all relate to. It's the depression phase. It's the time when you're asking yourself, what's the point of going on after this loss? At this stage of depression, you have come to recognize that a loss has occurred or will occur. You have began to isolate yourself from other people. You have stopped doing the things that you would normally do. You no longer find joy and happiness in the things that you once did. You spend time crying. You have crying spells that you can't control. You are in a place where it just doesn't seem like life is worth living anymore. I've definitely been in that place. I've definitely been in the place to where killing yourself, and I'm just going to be straight up about it, taking your own life seemed like the right thing to do. It seemed like the best option. I've sometimes described it as the suicidal ideation can be like the feeling that you feel when you feel love. It feels good. It feels right. It feels inviting. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody's experience, but that has been my experience with this depression stage of the grieving process. What's the point of going on when my child has died? What's the point of going on when my lifelong partner has passed away? What is the point of going on when I no longer have this job with this title? What's the point of going on? That's what you ask yourself in this depression stage. It's a very, I'll say, dark and lonely place to be in the grieving process. Now, again, remember, you can move through any of these stages in any order, but at the end of it, you will get to a place of acceptance, which is the last stage in the grieving cycle. In the stages of grief, you will finally get to a place where you tell yourself, you know what? Everything is going to be okay. And one of my mentors, Ron Johnson, he's a great guy. He's just an awesome man. He's been mentoring me for the past 11 years now. And Ron has a very unique story. If you've ever read my book, The Miracle Maker, chapter 9 is about Ron Johnson. And in his story, he experienced his mother being shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. Accidentally shot and killed by someone who was trying to kill his aunt. But instead of his aunt being hit by the bullets, his mother was hit by the bullets and she died. Ron was a football player at Tennessee State University at the time, and of course he was devastated and shocked by the loss. And so now, years later, I think it's been 20 plus years since his mother was murdered. When he talks about his mother, he always reminds me of a statement that she always told him when things just didn't seem to be going right. And that statement was simple: everything is going to be okay. When you get to the place where you have accepted the loss of your loved one, that means you are now understanding the situation in a more rational or logical manner. That means you've come to terms emotionally with the situation. You are at a place to where you're like, okay, there is a purpose in my life. I need to continue to live on. Again, this is the integrated grief phase. It's the phase where you've accepted the reality, but it doesn't mean that you don't love or you don't miss the person that you lost. It just means that you've accepted their loss. It just means that you are coping with it in a healthy way that has allowed you to get to this place of acceptance. So, let's recap these stages of grief, all right? So you first have the denial stage, where you're telling yourself this just cannot be happening. You have the anger phase where you're saying or asking yourself, why is this happening to me? You have the bargaining phase where you are willing to do anything to try to change the situation, change the loss, even though you know that there's really not anything that you can do. Then you go into the depression phase when you're questioning what's the point of going on after this loss. And then you have the acceptance phase where you know for certain that everything is going to be okay. Do you have those stages? Now, the reason that I decided to do a show on this particular topic is because I know that people are grieving. All around the world, people are grieving. This is a show that every person can relate to. I'm thinking about my own family. I'll tell this story real quickly before I move on to the little exercise that I want you guys to do if you are grieving. I want to tell this story. I think about my family when I think about this show. And I'm thinking about a more recent situation. On May the 2nd of 2018, my younger cousin, one of my young cousins, was shot and killed. The day that he was shot and killed is the same day that my son was born. Just a few hours later, in the same hospital. And so I think about the grief that has struck my family again. And then I also think about the bizarre fact that, yet again, a time in my life where I'm supposed to be experiencing elation, I am now in the depths, or I am now in the clutch of grief. And I think about my uncle, and I think about my aunt. I think about my cousin's mother. I think about his siblings. I think about my mother. I think about all the pain. And so this show is personal for me. And I know this show is something that many of you needed to hear. And I hope that you will share this with anyone that you know that is currently grieving. So what I would like for you to do in these last few minutes of today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about an exercise that I would like for you to do. I want you to go through and think about your own grief. And this is a good thing to do even if you've moved on from your grief. It's just a good exercise. Maybe you can help someone else with this. But I want you to go through those 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I want you to, first I want you to get out a sheet of paper, or you can do this in your phone. I take a lot of notes in my phone. So I actually wrote my first book completely, not completely, but like 80% of my first book was written in the notes app on my phone. And so if you are listening to this on your phone, which I know most of you are listening to this on your phone, especially our subscribers, I want you to open up your notes app, and I want you to write down denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. If you're not on your notes app, you can write it on a sheet of paper. And in each one of those stages, I want you to describe how each of the stages has affected you. The denial phase. This can't be happening. You know how I told my story when my sister passed, when I was just like, no, this just can't be happening. I took a nap, woke up, it's still happening. I want you to write your description of what happened in the denial phase. In the anger phase, why is this happening to me? You know, how have you experienced this stage of grief? The bargaining phase. Did you tell yourself that you will do anything to change the situation? Did you ask the question why it couldn't be me instead? I want you to write down your experience with this section or this particular stage of grief. Depression. Talk to me about your depression. Did you feel suicidal? Did you feel like everything was your fault? Did you stop doing the things that you normally do? Did you miss work for an extended period of time? Did you isolate yourself from all your friends and acquaintances? How have you experienced the depression stage? And then finally, I want you to write about your acceptance stage. In this stage where you tell yourself, I know what happened. I know I can't change it. And I know that I have to move forward with my life. And I now need to cope with this loss. I want you to write about your thoughts around the acceptance of the loss of your loved one or the loss of whatever you're grieving. So I just want you to spend some time with that. And this is going to help you begin to process your grief. Now, this is something that you can do alone. This is something that you can do with a trusted friend. This is something that you can do with a therapist. I do this with my clients often. Those who are struggling with the loss of a loved one. Another way you can process your grief is write a letter to the person that you've lost. If it's a situation where you've lost a person, write a letter to that person. We call it a goodbye letter. Write a goodbye letter to that person because oftentimes, like in my situation, I didn't get to say bye to my loved ones. And so sometimes you need to have an outlet to just say what you need to say, even though you know they will never read it. But there is a therapeutic benefit of you writing a letter and saying your final goodbyes to the person that you've lost. And so that's what I'd like for you to do today. Today we've discussed the grieving process. I've told you that everybody grieves differently. I've told you that grief is the emotional response that's triggered from the loss of a loved one. I've told you that only about 10% of people develop what's known as complicated grief. I've given you an exercise to help you process each stage of grief, and after I've told you about every stage of grief. I want you to know that grief is a natural process and that it doesn't always require that you go and talk to a counselor. But in many times, it will require you to seek professional treatment. The biggest thing about managing and overcoming grief is not trying to go at it alone, because it can be overwhelming and it could lead you to a dark place. I want to close today's show by sending up a prayer for anyone who is currently in the grieving process. I am a man of spiritual faith, and I do believe that there is a higher power that has ultimate power over the affairs on this rock that we live on. And so, if you don't mind, I'm just going to say a quick prayer, and then we're going to wrap up today's show. So, to our Creator in heaven, we thank you for this glorious day. We thank you for the air in our bodies that gives us life. We thank you for our ability to use our senses so that we can see and hear and touch and smell. And even if any of those senses are no longer available to us, we come back to the fact that we just thank you for life. To the Creator, we just ask that you give everyone who is suffering from grief a state of peace. Remind them that even though a storm may be over you, that above the clouds, it's still a bright and shiny day. My prayer is with the Abercrombie family today. We are praying for a miracle to take place. And let this prayer join in the echoes of the millions of other people who are praying for this young man. We pray that the grieving process is natural. We pray that anyone listening to this podcast today who may find themselves in a state of grief will find relief from the information that was shared today. We pray that today is going to be a great day. And we thank you for giving it to us yet again. Wow. If you believe that prayer, I just hope that this is going to resonate with you. This is not the hype show that we normally do, but this is a show that takes time out to recognize that we all are going through and will experience grief at some point in our lives. If you found today's show helpful, I really want to hear from you. Send me a direct message on Instagram, Eric_the_counselor. You can also email me at eric@capeheartcounseling.co. That's Capeheart, CAPEHART, counseling.co. Eric@capeheartcounseling.co is a place that you can send me a private message to let me know that this show has helped you in your life. That's all the time that I have for you today. I pray that you make it a great day. Until next time, folks, I'm out.
Thanks for listening to the Morning Huddle Podcast. For more information about this episode, please visit www.themorninghuddlepodcast.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at Eric_the_counselor. All information set forth in the Morning Huddle Podcast and on themorninghuddlepodcast.com is not professional mental health care or medical care. Information expressed is provided for educational and informational purposes only, without any express or implied warranty of any kind.